Hello, this is going to be a talk about how we don't just see an object moving, but when we see them moving, we attribute the motion to forces like internal or external forces. My name is Hongwin. Thank you for coming to our talk. When we see object move, we also make rich inferences about the physical forces that act on those objects in order to explain their motion. For example, when we view a movie clip such as this, we don't just see that the bugs are moving, but we also see why they are moving, which is due to the force that is being exerted on them by the water. And this is critically important in order, for example, to predict what will happen next if the bugs let go of the branch. There's plenty of evidence that people can reason about physical forces. For example, McCloskey et al. 1980 found that people commonly incorrectly predict that an object exiting a curved tube will follow a nonlinear trajectory upon exiting. Battaglia et al. 2013 suggested that people can make judgments about whether the tower will fall. But do we also perceive physical forces? Recent work suggests that physical forces may be represented in a more immediate and perceptual way. For example, physical information is integrated into specific visual processes, such as attentive tracking and visual detection. A key test of whether forces are really recovered perceptually is whether they interact with the perception of other visual features. Does the perception of forces influence how we see objects move? So for experiment 1, participants were asked to complete an acceleration detection experiment in which each trial features a moving dot. There were 32 upward trials and 32 downward trials, and they must indicate after each trial whether the dot accelerated or remained at a constant speed. In both the upward and downward conditions, the dot will accelerate on half of the trials and remain at a constant speed on the other half. First, let's take a look at an upward moving object accelerating. Here it is again. Here is the same exact acceleration now performed by a downwardly moving object, which looks more like slider moving down a hill. As you can see, compared to the acceleration of the upwardly moving object, this acceleration is far less noticeable. For both the upward and downward conditions, we computed D'. D' is a measure of sensitivity which factors out response bias. We found that participants better at acceleration detection for objects that move upward. Given the importance of direct replications, we also ran the study again for the new sample of 100 subjects. And we found the same results. The results are quite amazing and suggest that perception of acceleration really is better when objects appear to resist the external force of gravity. The results align with past research on how cell proportions make things look alive. For example, in Tremollet and Feldman 2006 paper, where observers viewed a moving dot, when those dots change heading, the same exact heading changes were judged to be less alive looking, such as in a condition where there was the presence of the paddles. The paddles make those headings change look like bouncing, but when the paddles were absent, those heading change are more alive looking, and those heading change thus appeared to be self-propelled. Pratt et al. 2010 suggested that self-propelled looking heading chains also capture attention in a probe detection task. Given these past results, it is intriguing that in our experiments, the speed increase were more noticeable when the objects were moving upward, such that those speed changes could only be explained by the internal forces within the object, which cause it to overcome the pervasive force of gravity. Is this an advantage for speed changes that look self-propelled? Or might somehow other low-level factors explain our results? If this is really an advantage for self-propelled speed changes, then when it comes to detecting deceleration, the previously observed advantage should reverse. Specifically, observers should be more sensitive to deceleration when an object is moving downward, which means when the object appears to self-propel and resisting the force of gravity, and less sensitive to deceleration when the object is moving upward and so slowing down due to the external force of gravity. In experiment 2, observers view half upward and half downward trials. In both conditions, the dot decelerated on half of trials and remained at constant speed on the other, and observers reported after each trial whether or not the dot decelerated. Now, let's take a look at an upward moving object decelerating. Here it is again. And here's the same exact deceleration now performed by a downwardly moving object. Here it is again. Here we again computed d prime. Compared to the previous experiment, here the pattern of results perfectly reversed, with more sensitivity to deceleration when it was performed by downward moving objects compared to upward moving ones. We also ran the study again on a new sample of 100 subjects. And we also found the same results, which suggests that the perception of accelerations really is better when objects appear to resist the external force of gravity. Both of the previous findings raise the questions that is this an advantage for speed changes that look self-propelled or speed changes of self-propelled objects, even when those speed changes themselves don't look self-propelled. To make this distinction clear, let's again consider the clip that I showed at the start of this presentation. The bugs clearly have the capacity to self-propel and to resist external forces. But this is a case where when speed change eventually occurs, it once that happens despite the self-propelness, not because of it. Might we be generally more sensitive to the speed change of self-propelled looking objects, even when they lose the battle, to an external forces? In other words, are we more sensitive to the speed change of self-propelled looking objects, even when those speed changes do not themselves look self-propelled? In our final experiment, we tested subjects' sensitivity to the acceleration of objects that rotated either in the same directions as they were moving or opposite the directions that they were moving. We tested this using discs with symbol wedge pattern on them. When a disc rotates clockwise and accelerates rightward, its acceleration could be self-propelled, for example, like a race car wheel propelling a car forward, or it could also be externally caused, for example, the wind causing a beach ball to roll along the beach. But when a wheel rotates counterclockwise and accelerates rightward, the only interpretation that this is an object with an internal motive force causing it to rotate backward, whose accelerations is due to it losing a battle with an external force. If observers are more sensitive to the acceleration of objects that rotate backward, this would suggest that the advantage is for objects capable of self-propulsions, even when those speed changes do not themselves appear self-propelled, but rather due to an external force. Here is an example of a trial in which the disc rotated in the direction it was moving and slightly speed up partway through the trial. Here it is again. Now, here's the disc that is rotating opposite its direction of movement. You may find that when it accelerates by the same amount, it's far more noticeable. For both backward and forward conditions, we computed DPRAM and found that participants better at acceleration detection for objects that rotate against the direction of motion. When we ran the study again, a new sample of 100 subjects, we found the same result. The experiments collectively shown that we perceive physical forces. More specifically, our experiments collectively showed how perceiving external forces, such as wind and gravity, influences the perception of how objects move. In particular, we found a greater sensitivity to speed change of objects that look self-propelled, such that if we see an object as having the capacity of self-propulsion, we become more sensitive to its speed change, even if it loses the battle with an external force. At the start of this presentation, I suggested that one way to test whether we perceive physical forces, rather than just reasoning about them when we are asked to, is to test for ways in which seeing forces influence the perception of other features. All three of these experiments support the conclusion that the perception of physical forces is a richly interactive part of visual processing, and that the hidden forces are automatically inferred to be acting objects can have a surprisingly big influence on our perception of how objects move. So, with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I would also like to thank you, the New School Visual Perception Lab. If you would like to learn more about our lab research, please feel free to check out the lab website at nssrperception.com. Thank you again and enjoy OPAM.